Czechoslovakian, well, actually Russian design, infrared binoculars. And I took a pair home because, and I got tired of looking at the neighbor's cats at night and dogs, And then I kind of turned it up to the sky. And that's when I was shocked. I saw what you were mentioning, these triangle type things or whatever. What I saw was a lot of things moving real high speed, coming to a dead stop, and then veering off at another angle at a high speed. Such a high speed, if it was a human in it, they would be, mush inside whatever they're flying in. And
they'd be liquefied.
They would be liquefied. And I told one of our customers who actually ran the observatory up in Puyallup, Washington, about it. I let him borrow a pair of these. He took it home, and within a week, every member of their, club, observatory club, bought them, and they were all giving me, they were excited. They were telling me all these reports of they've seen these objects zigzagging and all this stuff, at night. That they couldn't see with their telescope at the observatory. They just wasn't there. But when they were looking under, the infrared binoculars, there they were. Now, I mentioned this to a scientist one day, and he said, well, what that was? It's probably just fireflies. And I go, no. This is not fireflies.
Oh, really? That again?
Yeah, it was a good trying to debunk it,
Right. They'll go to any extreme. I think there's two reasons for that. One, I think there is a definite cover-up going on because people are either ridiculed or they are pressured not to speak or they are harassed or they are even killed sometimes. Sidney Sheldon, a very famous author of murder mysteries, that sort of thing, thrillers, just before his last book was written, he came up with the so-called Sheldon's List of all the researchers who have been involved in stuff that mysteriously died, and in swarms, like in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. I mean, incredible numbers of deaths of researchers, so including microbiologists, oddly enough. But, I do think that there's a cover-up going on. I do think there's an organized effort to stop it. But also, I think a lot of people don't want it to be true. They don't want to face the reality that we're not the top of the food chain.
I agree with you 100% on that. And I do think that maybe it's because also here recently, as you know, as an author, the big bandwagon right now was disclosure for the last 6-7 months. I mean, people came out with UFO books that were just every day was like somebody cranking out a new one. And I hate to say it, at one point, I actually got a book from one author, and I got another book from another author, and I was reading them, and then I said, that reminds me of a book going back a couple years ago by another author, and I found they were literally stealing other authors, information, changing a few words around, and they created their own book. But it seemed like a lot of people wanted to grab onto it for financial gain.
Well, of course, you always do get that. I mean, if something suddenly becomes popular, people seem to want to drive it into the ground, whether it was the vampire movies of a while back and then later the werewolf movies and then the demons and angel movies. But, I mean, and then zombie movies, I think, is the last big wave, and that seems to finally be dying down. But, I mean, you couldn't turn around where there wasn't a zombie book or a zombie TV show or several and all sorts of zombie movies. I mean, there was even one movie called Zombievers, which, by the way, was kind of fun. But it just gets to the point where it's ridiculous. But, yeah, people do jump on the bandwagon, and whenever they think money's involved, then they really jump on the bandwagon. So you have the diligent researchers, and there are a lot of them out there. Most of your people in MUFON, the field investigators, they're really in it because they want to learn. My problem with MUFON is it's constantly gathering data, but it never seems to use the data. It never seems to massage the data to try to come up with answers. I mean, one of the first things I always want to know was, is there a pattern to these sightings? And there is a pattern only in the sense that they seem to suddenly conglomerate in certain regions and areas and are seen often. Now, some of those sightings are real and some of them are people misconstruing things and, again, jumping on the bandwagon. But there's no doubt that there were certain regions at certain times that seemed to be hot spots for UFO sightings. Pine Bush, New York, along the Hudson River Valley, Gulf Breeze, Florida, several places in Australia, Belgium, in Europe, France for a while. And it seems to switch, but there seems to be a lot of evidence that this sort of thing is going on. So what do we make of it? That's the big question. What do we do about it? For me, the evidence is in. It's not good. So what do we do about it?
Well, I hate to say it. I know from the government side, because they have covered it up for so many years and decades, that they can't come out and be clean. Could you imagine if they came out tomorrow in the news and said, UFOs are here? They're actually here. They've been visiting Earth for this amount of years, and they're not friendly towards humans. How many people would panic? It brings me with something you said earlier, Rob, that there's people out there that'll go out places like Mount Adams, for example, is a hot spot for UFOs. They'll go out there in groups with their laser lights and all this weird stuff trying to attract UFOs. They're really brave because, I hate to say it. How many people maybe have disappeared doing that?
Same thing. I went to Hudson River Valley area and did the same thing. Had a half a megawatt bright light that was shining up in the sky and blinking and flashing, trying to track UFOs. This is before the evidence was in, so to speak, and back when I just wanted to see UFO and kick the tires of one. But I don't know that I think it was more foolish than brave, because in retrospect, I think it was kind of nuts I was doing that.
Well, I hate so. If you don't mind, if we go over, it's only 10 minutes left of the show, but if you want to go over another 10 minutes, because I do want to touch some things. I do want to say that Michael W. Hall, who used to be a host on my network, he went to Mount Adams here about a year ago with a group of people, late August. And they were filming, trying to get proof of UFOs. They had their laser lights going, all this weird stuff. And at one point, this is what I was told, that a UFO appeared in front of them. And it shot out some type of like a laser light of like bluish or some color, right? Then strange things happened that night. Michael used a thing to help him breathe at night, and the battery went dead in it. So he told his friend, hey, the battery's dead. His friend said, don't worry about it. I got another battery. We'll just swap batteries. He went to go urinate. Okay. And he claims he just went to urinate. He was gone for over an hour. Where he went to urinate was a makeshift porta potty right next to the camper trailer he was in. And he got back and his friend goes, why were you gone so long? He goes, I was only gone for a minute or two. Now, some of the weird things that he said, claimed that his watch was phosphorus coated, all of a sudden was brighter than ever, which shouldn't even be glowing at that like 2 o'clock in the morning. The phosphorus should have lost its charge. But in the morning, they were walking by a guy's car, and all of a sudden their compasses went crazy, and all of a sudden the car supposedly was magnetized. A whole bunch of weird things. It's supposed to have transpired that night. I don't know if it's real or not. But, again, if you're going to go out there looking for UFOs, I wouldn't do it. I mean, that's just like going out by yourself, right, and looking for a serial killer. You might find one.
Right, and who really wants to? I know. Well, with my brother, he was 16. He was with a friend. They were camping out in the desert, dropped off by his friend's father. Late at night, they saw a bright reddish light. I think it was red, across the sky, and it looked like it came down near them. They decided they'd check it out. So they took their flashlights and started to walk. And that's the last thing they remember. The next morning, they got up. They didn't talk about it. They struck camp. His father came and picked them both up and took them away. My brother grew up. He moved away to Las Vegas. And for years, they just rolled by, nothing. Then suddenly he spontaneously remembered that part of the event. So he called up his friend, and he said, what's going on here? Do you remember this at all? And his friend goes, yes, I do. And he goes, do you remember what we did once we decided to walk out and look for that thing? And his friend says, no, I don't. And they have missing time. They can't account for what happened between the time they started to look for it and when they got up in the morning. He said to him, we didn't even discuss it the next morning. Isn't that a little unusual? And his friend goes, yeah, it is. Now, so compelling was this for them that the friend eventually, who was married with children, sold his home in San Diego, moved to Las Vegas to be near my brother so they could further investigate, which they did for a number of years. And then my brother hit a certain point where he didn't want anything more to do with it at all. He just shut himself down and out of it, and he's been that way ever since. And
did he get scared? Is that what did it?
Yes, he obviously was frightened. Pretty much said so. And I asked him, I said, well, Mike, on your deathbed, would you want to know the answer? And he said, it depends. I said, on what? And he said, on what the answer is. I said, in other words, if it's good news or bad news. He said, exactly. I said, so you'd rather die in peace if it's bad news than just not know? He says, yep. So, and that's my brother. And I trust my brother, and I believe my brother. And he has the scoop mark, and he did find a piece of material, foreign object, underneath his arm, near his elbow, I believe it was. And he didn't think to save it and keep it and show it to, any authorities or professionals who might have been able to check out what it was. So, because at the time he found it, it was when he was in the shower, and it was just a lump under his skin, and he pried at it, and this popped out. He didn't really think much of it. I mean, stuff happens when you're out in the desert and walking and hiking and that sort of thing. He just figures he may have stumbled, tripped, or been on a motorcycle and fell off and skidded and something got embedded. So, but he has not had hypnotism, and I told him I don't think he should, because if it's not done correctly, he could have false memories through the power of suggestion, and then those memories are as if they were real, and then you've lost the real evidence forever. So if you're going to have hypnotism, if you have missing time, please, please, please take my advice and go to the most reputable hypnotist you can find, not someone who just does it for the fun of it.
Oh, yeah, because, it can do more damage to you emotionally for the rest of your life. It could twist things around. Yeah, going back to Timothy Cullen, when he doesn't remember being abducted at all, but he does remember that him and his wife were going to town. They were at a stop sign, and on the side of a mountain, they saw a UFO, and that's all they remember. And then a couple of weeks later, he goes in, to the doctor for other things that happened to him. And all of a sudden, they find this implant in his arm. Again, it's like he remembers seeing the UFO, but that's all he remembered.
Yeah, they find him in nasal cavities. They found him embedded in the skin behind ears. They found him in arms. They found him in legs. My brother has no recollection of being abducted, and he does not claim abduction. He only claims missing time because he has no memory of abduction. So he's trying to be as honest and forthright about it as I think anyone could possibly be. And again, he's my he's my brother, and I believe him, whereas I might not believe someone else so readily, but I do believe him, and he's never changed his story in the last 30 years.
Yeah, well, undoubtedly he was abducted. Boy, again, so maybe before he does go for his deathbed, that he will maybe remember, because some of the people I've had on my show, it's been 20, 30 years, and they kind of start remembering something triggered it off, and they started remembering a little bit here and a little bit there.
Right, and that's what happened with him. Apparently he was watching a show on UFOs, and he recollected that event, and then he called his friend and said, do you remember this? And his friend said, well, I do now. I had until this moment. And he says, but yeah, now I remember us having that event. Again, neither one of them remembers being abducted, but they didn't even remember the event until, 10, 16 years later that anything at all had happened. So they did spontaneously remember the event taking place, the light in the sky coming down, but again, they don't have any recollection of abductions. So it's difficult. And by the way, even if abductions aren't real, this is a huge phenomenon in our society. Why aren't more scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, psychiatrists, psychologists investigating it as a social phenomena? Why would over 1 million people claim to be abducted? If it's real, that's truly awful. And if it isn't real, it's still a major social phenomena that should be investigated, and yet almost nobody is.
Well, I got a funny feeling they might get either a phone call or a knock on their door, and I can honestly say that can happen if you touch the wrong subject. I have, in the last 2 years, I touched a subject I shouldn't have touched. And I tell you, I had some threats by some government agencies all of a sudden saying if I ever talked about that subject again, all the various things that could happen to me. And that was enough where it got me, to cool my jets on a certain subject.
Oh, right. Absolutely. I mean, the intimidation thing works really well if they come for me, I would be intimidated. I did do one radio show where they did it at a studio and downloaded it to a laptop, and they had 2 copies at the studio and a laptop copy, and all of them vanished. I had to redo the entire show. It was pre-recorded. And they couldn't account for it. They couldn't account for how it had disappeared from two different hard drives. And